Before I begin this video, I want to introduce you to a famous historical person. This statue was erected in the late 19th century in celebration of a figure called Edward Colston. He was a famous trader in the 1600s and early 1700s. His company, the Royal African Company, brought things like sugar, tobacco and cotton to Britain. These products were affordable and they helped improve people's lives. As a result, Colston became fabulously wealthy. Upon his death, Colston became something of a philanthropist. This is someone who uses their wealth to help others. He left much of his fortune to the city of Bristol, where he established his businesses. To this day, streets and even theatres and towers are named after Colston, and this statue was erected in celebration of his life. He was referred to as a wise and virtuous person. However, there have been calls to remove this statue. As I produced this video in June of 2020, in the midst of a worldwide pandemic and in the midst of worldwide protests against racism, I'm going to be touching today on a topic that is very topical indeed. The reason is because Colston's statue doesn't just celebrate a man who helped Bristol. It celebrates a man who made thousands of people suffer and die, because he didn't just trade sugar, tobacco and cotton. He traded lives. He traded black people from Africa. He was a slave trader. Despite decades of calls to remove Edward Colston's statue from Bristol and divides in the community about whether to remove the statue is to try and erase history, people took matters into their own hands recently. The statue was toppled during a Black Lives Matter protest, and it was tossed off the quay into the River Avon. There is a certain irony to this. Many of Colston's victims, and they were victims, also ended up at the bottom of the sea, having been casually discarded off slave trading ships as commodities rather than human beings. So from this quay, where many of Colston's slave ships left to trade their human beings and other products over the world, Colston now finds himself at the bottom of the harbour too. Whatever the rights and wrongs of this action, and I'm not going to give you my opinion on this, this has brought into sharp focus Britain's relationship with the slave trade and Britain confronting its past. We're going to attempt to do that today. This is a difficult task enough when I've got a class in front of me and where we can get into a meaningful dialogue. So how sensitive and how difficult this may be trying to do it remotely is something that I'm acutely aware of. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and give you the context. I'm going to try and give you the facts and rely largely on primary sources in order to do this. You can then make your own mind up. But there is one thing that I will not negotiate on. Slavery was an evil. Racism is wrong. And before we proceed, we will do so bearing these things in mind. It's worth bearing in mind too what brought this into such sharp relief in the year of 2020. The Black Lives Matter movement has been around for some time, recognising the statistical fact that black people are more in danger of various social ills, but in particular of being victims of police brutality. A recent incident of police brutality which was filmed was the death of George Floyd. A drawing of him can be seen on one of these signs. A police officer in Minneapolis in the USA placed his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck and he died. That knee was on his neck for almost 9 minutes. The officer has been sacked and he has been charged with second-degree murder and his trial is yet to take place. However, this shocking footage, which was seen around the world, prompted people to rise up in protest. Protests have happened all over the United States, and they have spread elsewhere in the world too, including in the UK. Note that one of the protesters here is holding up a sign that they have made that says the UK is not innocent. It's an interesting statement, and it's one that is worth considering. When we look at inequality in our own society, it is worth also reflecting on past inequalities and what this country did in order to get some of its wealth. This can be an uncomfortable process, and it's not about beating ourselves up in the modern day, It's about recognising what happened in the past, whilst also realising that those things are not our fault. But it is our responsibility to remember these things, if we think that they are worthy of remembrance. For my part as a teacher, I think they very much are, and we're going to begin that process today. So your title today of this online lesson is The Slave Trade. Our aims are to know why Europeans traded slaves and how they profited from it, and to know the effects of the slave trade on those who were enslaved. Some do now tasks. This picture shows recently captured slaves being transported to the coast. Describe what people appear to have been taken captive. Describe 2 ways that they are being controlled. And then lastly, the man carrying the gun in the centre of the picture, or rather to the centre right, appears to be African. What might be surprising about this? Pause the video now while you complete these do now tasks as an introduction. So for question 1, you should have recognised that these are black African people, but there are men, women and children here. That tells us that all types of people were taken captive during the slave trade. They are being controlled in various ways. You may notice that they are being chained together. Some of them have their necks fastened together with bound pieces of wood. This would have made it virtually impossible for them to run away without very serious injury or possibly even death. And lastly, they appear to be being guarded. There seems to be a man who's holding a gun. Possibly to the right there seems to be another man who could be holding a whip, but this is a little bit unclear in this particular picture. The man who appears to be African who is carrying the gun might be surprising because he is enslaving other Africans. However, a common tactic of Europeans was to get other African people on side to try and enslave rival tribes in return for goods and commodities that they really valued. That's not to say that they were orchestrating the slave trade, merely to say that they perhaps collaborated with the Europeans and helped enable it. We're going to have a look at what the slave trade really was. This map shows the North Atlantic Ocean with the continents of Europe, Africa, North and South America. To certain degrees, all of these continents were involved in this trade. We're going to look at something called the triangular trade. So let's imagine we have a trading boat up there in England, or Europe more generally. These ships would be loaded with the following products. More as well, but these were perhaps some of the most common ones. They were loaded with firearms and guns, alcohol, things like rum, and with horses. These were all products which were scarce in Africa, and so were in high demand by people with money there. The ship would sail to Africa where these things would be sold, or often exchanged for captured African slaves. The slaves would then be crammed aboard these ships in the most appalling conditions, where they would take several weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Once there, the slaves would be offloaded and sold. There they would be put to work. Slaves, remember, are not paid for their work, they have no freedom, and they are not allowed to change their jobs. They are literally the property of the people who force them to do these things. And what work did they do? Well, various, but it was largely agricultural. They would be growing things. Things that they grew included sugarcane, cotton and tobacco. These products, which were in high demand in Europe, would be loaded back onto those ships and returned to Europe, where they would be offloaded and sold at a profit. This part here is known as the Middle Passage. We'll be looking at this later on. Middle in the sense that you've got the trip to Africa first, then the trip across, and then the trip back to Europe. The Middle Passage took many weeks, and it was where some of the most appalling aspects of the slave trade happened, and that's why we're going to be paying particular attention to the conditions on the Middle Passage later on. First of all then, some tasks for you. Why was slave labour so profitable for the Europeans? Secondly, there were no stages of the trade triangle where the boat was empty. Explain how that made journeys more profitable. Thirdly, why do you think some Africans helped with the capture of slaves? Think about the things that the Europeans were trading. And lastly, obviously slavery is immoral or wrong. What reason or reasons might explain why European traders still did it? Also, you'll notice in the description to this video there is a link to a map that you can use to produce your own triangular trade diagram, like the one that I've done here. Make sure that you indicate the arrows on where the things are being taken and the products and, sadly, people who were loaded at various stages of the triangle. That should take you a little while to do, so pause the video here and then we'll go through some feedback. So why was slave labour so profitable for the Europeans? The fact is that slaves did not require paying. One of the biggest costs for any business is paying their staff. By removing this, the Europeans could make much greater profits from their products, even while selling them very cheaply. And because the ships were not empty for any stage of this triangular trade, it meant it was very efficient for the Europeans. There was no stage of this trade triangle where they weren't making money from something, either by making money or trading slaves with the guns, alcohol and horses that they would trade in Africa, or by making money by selling the slaves that they had captured, or by making money by selling the products that the slaves produced. So why did some Africans help with the capture of slaves? Well, there are various reasons for this. Often it related to existing tensions and conflicts within Africa, which the Europeans were able to exploit to their own ends. Not only that, those who collaborated felt that it was less likely that they would be taken captive as slaves themselves. But also, those products, guns, alcohol and horses, were not widely available in Africa at this time, and so they were desired by some of these people. However, it's worth remembering that it was the Europeans who were orchestrating this. And obviously slavery is immoral. So what reason or reasons might explain why the European traders used it? Well, perhaps the biggest motivator is simply that it made them very, very wealthy indeed. In fact, as we'll see in future lessons, the wealth that they had still has a knock-on impact on the British economy and European economy as a whole to this day. But there is another aspect here, and that's racism. At this time, these black Africans were not seen as being equally human by many of the Europeans who traded them. Instead, they were viewed more as animals. This is clearly a very wrong and distressing view, but it was the fact at the time, and that helped these Europeans to excuse to themselves at least what they were doing, something that we would today recognise as being inherently evil. We're going to look at the Middle Passage now. This is possibly the most distressing part of the slave trade that we're going to look at today, so do prepare yourself for this because it's going to be deeply unpleasant. You might want to add this as a subheading now. To introduce you to the Middle Passage, I've included in the description to this video links to a couple of videos. One of them has some narration from historians explaining the impact of the Middle Passage, and the other is a recreation of the Middle Passage from an old TV show called Roots. Despite the fact that this was made almost 40 years ago now, it is quite an honest depiction of what the Middle Passage was like without it showing the full horrors. Nevertheless, some of this content might be quite distressing to you. It does refer, at least subtly at times, to some really awful things. You can see the people chained up underneath the decks. You can see the people suffering. You can see their fear. But it also refers to other things as well, including the sexual abuse of some of the female slaves. So, do be prepared for that if you want to watch these. If you're unsure as to whether it would be appropriate, maybe get a parent to watch it first, or another adult. Or, if you want to ignore it entirely, you can still work from these sources, but perhaps it will not have quite the same impact if you haven't watched the videos first. Source 1 then. This is from a leaflet that was produced by an abolitionist campaign group. Abolitionists wanted to end the practice of slavery. This they were successful in doing eventually. This diagram shows cross-sections through a slave ship and gives an indication as to how slaves were loaded onto the ships. You can see that they are lying on their backs, tied, with their hands and feet bound, and they are crammed in so tight that they can barely move. In case you cannot read the text in the middle, I shall read it to you. Plan showing the stowage of 130 additional slaves round the wings or sides of the lower deck by means of platforms or shelves in the manner of galleries in a church. The slaves stowed on the shelves and below them have only a height of 2 feet 7 inches between the beams and far less under the beams. What that means is it gives us an indication of how little space these people had, and the fact that it wasn't just people lying on the deck, but also on shelves constructed around the outside too. So you have hundreds of people crammed into these ships. I need you to create a table like this. In an earlier Industrial Revolution video you did a similar task, And you're going to be doing that again, except this time, if you've done the previous video, you'll find that I'll be giving you less help with this. There will be some verbal feedback, but you will not see any written feedback on the screen. Nevertheless, this is what you need to include. There will be 4 sources in total, the first of which is already shown. Describe the source and who created it, the conditions that the slaves lived in, and how this might have felt. That last part is called an empathy task, is where we try to imagine how people in the past felt. Give that some time. It'll probably take you about 5 to 10 minutes to work through this source, or possibly slightly in between that. So pause the video and complete the task now. So, you should have described the source as being a diagram showing how slaves were loaded onto a slave ship created by an abolitionist group who were against slavery. You should be able to identify how the slaves were inhumanly crammed together on the decks of this ship. You might be able to identify how this would feel as well, how uncomfortable it would be to have the chains digging into your feet, how hot it might have been with that number of people crammed into an enclosed space, and how terrifying it may have been to be in the dark, surrounded by other suffering people, not knowing what was happening to you or where you were going. Truly, this was a horrific part of the slave trade. Source 2. Part of an interview with a man called Thomas R. Broth, a slave ship crew member in 1761. Thomas R. Broth was not a captain of a ship, he was an ordinary crewman who agreed to give some details as to what the slave trade was like. All the males were forcibly branded with a hot iron and loaded down with heavy shackles. I'll just pause there for a moment. Branding is where you take a red hot iron and permanently burn a scar into someone's skin. It's a very painful process, but it was often done at the time with animals too, in order to permanently identify them as belonging to a particular farm. So this is sort of part of the process of treating these people like animals rather than the human beings that they were. Heavy shackles would be those kind of hand and leg cuff arrangements with heavy chains on them so that they couldn't run away. Completely naked, they were chained together in the tens by neck, hands and feet, bound down with irons and crushed almost unto death, and all for the purpose of maintaining due subordination, which means to keep order and stop them fighting back, and preserving the peace and safety of everyone on board. Well, I think we can reflect on that last sentence, can't we? The peace and safety of everyone on board. Clearly the intention here is not to keep the slaves safe, but to keep the white crew safe. Source 2. Describe the source and who created it, conditions the slaves lived in, and how this might have felt. Pause the video now while you do that. Hopefully we've identified some of the things about this source. It's a primary source written in 1761, and it's from an interview with an actual slave ship crew member. So presumably he would know what he was talking about. The conditions the slave lived in, we have the branding of them, we have the chaining of them, and the fact that they are basically kept in prison-like conditions or worse. So how might this have felt? Well, we have the fear of having been constricted like this. We've also got the discomfort of being chained down and how those iron shackles might cut into the skin. People had to wear these shackles virtually permanently for weeks at a time. So the sores that they would get from this could even be infectious and make them die. Source 3. From a memoir by former slave Abolitionists Equiano. He is pictured in the top right of this screen. A memoir is a book that's written basically as someone's life story. Think of the word memory. This is a collection of their memories. Abolitionists Equiano produced his memoir as a way of communicating the horrors of slavery that he had actually encountered. As a result, he became reasonably famous in his own time, and then was forgotten for some time, and in more recent years his work has been rediscovered. The closeness, which means the sweaty heat of the place, and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains. That means the sort of rubbing and cutting of the chains I described earlier, which had now become insupportable. and the filth of the necessary tubs, these are toilet buckets, into which the children fell and were almost suffocated. Really unpleasant stuff. So again, describe the source and who created it. Describe the conditions that the slaves lived in. And how might that have felt to have been in that position? Pause the video now while you complete this. So the source was created by a former slave called Alaudo Equiano. It's in his memoir, which means it's a collection of his written memories. The conditions refer to the suffocating conditions below decks and how horribly hot it would have been and stuffy. The cutting of the chains and shackles into the arms and legs, as we've seen before. The unsanitary conditions, which, remember, would not just be unpleasant but could spread disease, are the fact that there are only buckets for people to go to the toilet in. And it doesn't take much imagination to consider how ill these people might have become, and how actually going to the toilet in a bucket was often not an option for them, and they would have to simply go where they lay. And also the horror of watching young children falling off and sometimes into these buckets. Clearly these lives were not being valued in any way, shape or form, except for how much profit they could gain from them at the end. So how would this have made people feel? Well, there is the obvious horror and discomfort, but perhaps a sense of powerlessness too. Perhaps you can work out for yourself why these people might have felt so powerless. Finally, source 4. This is more from Alaudo Equiano's memoir. He describes the way that the slaves were fed on the journey. The women used broad sticks as spoons, which they turn around licking and calling out "Sufi, Sufi." Then a man with a cat o' nine tails, which is a distinctive type of multi-pronged whip, gives them a scourge, which makes them cry out. When you scourge someone with a whip, it doesn't just hurt, it often cuts the skin too. When they go forward with the food, there is another man placed at the door of the barricade with a cudgel in hand. The chain is slackened to let the metal food bucket pass through the male slaves, and then they all fall down 10 in number around the bucket, and they have no spoons but their fingers. What Equiano is describing here is the process by which they were fed in the most inhumane conditions, and if you didn't get to the bucket in time, you simply didn't get anything at all. But also think again about how these people are being treated like animals. There's no dignity in this. They're simply being fed from a bucket like you would do with a pig or a cow, and they're expected to eat like that. But these people would have been so hungry and so desperate they had no other option. It is worth saying that these slaves were fed, but only a bare minimum. And after all, they were only being fed to keep them alive for the journey so that they could then be sold at a profit when they got to the Americas. So source 4. Describe the source and who created it. Describe the conditions that the slaves lived in, and how might this have felt. Pause the video now while you complete that. So for describing the source and who created it, we should have already got that information from source 3. The conditions that the slaves lived in means that they are being fed very little, and they're being fed in a very humiliating way. Try and include some specifics from the source. And lastly, how might this have felt? Well, many people would have been very hungry and very desperate for any food whatsoever. But also think about how degrading and how humiliating this would be. These people were being treated like animals. And yet they were not anything like animals. They were just as human as anybody else. So this truly is degrading and inhuman treatment on the part of the slave traders. What we're going to consider now is the position of an abolitionist. The first source you saw was a picture by an abolitionist organisation. These groups campaigned to end slavery, often by highlighting the cruel treatment of the slaves. This was sometimes based upon people's religious beliefs, although also people justified slavery on religious grounds too, and they were often led by white people, but not always. Abolitionists would write to their MPs and newspapers with their views. In other words, they tended to be coming from the more literate and wealthy classes. In a way, this might be a comparison with how people refer to white privilege today. The fact that skin colour can sometimes afford people certain extra rights which are denied to other people. And it's worth remembering that things like white privilege are not the fault of the people who have that privilege, but they just mean that perhaps in that one single respect, their lives might be easier than other people of other races. So this is an idea that's actually been around for a very long time. Your task is to write a letter to a newspaper, possibly the Times newspaper, which existed at this time, highlighting how bad the conditions for the slaves on the Middle Passage were. Use information from the 4 sources that we've looked at, but also from the videos if you've watched them. Be specific about the conditions they faced. Don't speak in generalisations. Try and describe it in as much detail as you can. Otherwise, your letter is not going to convince anybody. Letters at the time usually started the words, "Dear Sir." After all, the newspapers like the Times were owned and run by men. You could then begin it with this sentence: "I am writing to you to protest the treatment of slaves on the Middle Passage," and then go into detail as to how they are treated and why this is wrong. Take a moment to do this and aim to do about half a page of A4 in your letter as a minimum. Pause the video while you complete this. Okay, we'll move on. We're going to return now to the thing that we started with, the Colston Statue and why it is so controversial. Here he is again. Some facts about Colston. Edward Colston became fabulously wealthy. On his death, he left his fortune to the city of Bristol, establishing schools, public buildings and more. People hugely benefited from this, or rather, white people did. In the late 1800s, a statue was put up celebrating him. Colston got his money from slavery. It is thought that perhaps 1/4 of Colston's slaves died on the Middle Passage or working on plantations. This could be from having been thrown off the ships, died from the conditions, or died from the harshness of the realities of working on a slave plantation, which we'll look at in a future lesson. Effectively, black people died to make Colston rich. And so as a result, the statue has recently been removed by protesters. Imagine that you were on Bristol City Council. What would you want to happen to the statue? Now, what I'm conscious here is about not leading you to any one particular answer, and there is no wrong answer to this. There are strong and decent arguments for all sides here, and it is quite a sensitive topic, so give it some proper mature thought. One option might be to put it back where it was on its plinth. After all, if people want it removed, they can campaign for this through the council. The council, following the recent protests, will probably see the strength of public feeling. Although I would point out from a factual point of view that people have been campaigning for this statue to be removed for years anyway. Another option would be to place it in a museum or exhibition explaining Colston's role in the slave trade. Perhaps it could make quite an effective centrepiece to such an exhibition. A good way of teaching people about what Colston did whilst not forgetting him. Or perhaps you would prefer that it was destroyed forever. Perhaps you feel that someone like Colston does not deserve a statue and does not deserve to be remembered in this way. Whatever you believe, you will need to explain your choice. Or you could add another option of your own if you want. But whatever you do, explain it. And remember, there's no judgment here. You explain whatever your opinion is. I'm not going to tell you mine, although I do have one. It's up to you to think. What would you be most comfortable with, and why? Pause the video while you do this. Lastly then, consider this image that we saw at the start. It says again that the UK is not innocent. This is a very ambiguous statement. In other words, it can be taken in lots of different ways. However, consider what your opinion is. When it comes to the slave trade specifically, is the UK's history innocent? It's really important to remember that the past is not our fault as we live today. As it happens, I am a white man. That means that I don't experience some of the difficulties that other people do in society today. But I am a historian, and I do try and base my own opinions on the evidence that I find out about. So if you want to learn more, there are loads of resources out there, and I do urge you to do so if you find this interesting. But perhaps the slave trade is a really uncomfortable part of history. But often the most uncomfortable part of history, they may be the ones that are best worth remembering. I'll leave that with you for now. Thanks for giving this some serious thought, I'm sure that at times it's been unpleasant and difficult. And for what it's worth, it's been difficult for me to talk about from my position too. And so if you are unsure about anything, if you want to get into a bit of a dialogue over this, by all means contact me if you're able to. If not, I'll say thank you very much for watching. If you found this useful, do like the video and subscribe to the channel. And on that note, I'll say goodbye.